Welcome to UKR News. Russian army is losing in major operation by the Ukrainian army. The intensity of the conflicts in the Russian-Ukrainian war is often increasing in certain regions. Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts are undoubtedly at the top of these regions. The conflicts in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which started with Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, have never stopped. The cities of Bakhmut and Volodar, which are part of Donetsk Oblast, are among the most intense regions, with approximately 100 clashes a day. Last day, the Ukrainian army shared footage of what happened in the town of Volodar. The shared images revealed the losses of the Russian invaders in Volodar. The Russian army lost dozens of armored personnel carriers and tanks. The Ukrainian army shared footage of a number of destroyed military vehicles belonging to the Russian occupiers. The footage was recorded in Volodar, one of the cities where the fighting has been the most intense since the start of the war. The footage was released by the Ukrainian Brigadier General Oleksandr Tarnovsky, who heads the Tavria Tactical and Strategic Group. In the footage shared by Tarnovsky on his Telegram account, the damaged and abandoned military vehicles of the Russian occupiers were clearly visible. Dozens of vehicles were no longer usable. It was debated whether the vehicles, many of which were damaged, were tanks or armored personnel carriers. In a post on his Telegram account, Tarnovsky announced that the Ukrainian forces held their positions in the city of Volodar and thwarted the Russian invaders' plan to cross into the city of Avdiivka. The commander concluded his post with the following sentences: "Our artillery is working well today. Every soldier in the trenches fulfills his duties at the highest level." The Ukrainian army inflicted heavy losses on the Russian invaders during the attacks on Volodar by the Air Force and ground troops. Successful strikes by the missile and artillery units of the Air Force resulted in the destruction of tanks and armored personnel carriers of the Russian invaders. The Russian army has lost a total of 3,657 tanks and 7,083 armored combat vehicles since the start of the war, including the losses recorded in Volodar. According to a recent statement by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Defense Forces aviation carried out a series of strikes on areas with a high concentration of Russian occupation personnel. Among these areas were Bakhmut and Volodar, where the fighting was fierce. The General Staff announced that the missile and artillery units of the Air Force hit two ammunition depots, one fuel depot, a checkpoint, and anti-aircraft missile complexes of the Russian occupiers. In addition, the Ukrainian Air Force shot down 4 unmanned aerial vehicles of the Russian invaders. This new development was stated in the statement as follows: "Our defenders shot down 4 enemy drones to Orlan, 10 one-aileron reconnaissance, and 1 Lancet kamikaze drone." The area where the strikes took place was not disclosed. The Russian army suffered serious losses in Volodar, as it did in various other areas. However, the occupiers are trying to hide the losses in Volodar, just like the losses in other regions. A Russian war analyst wrote that the fighting in Volodar continued fiercely, but this news was untrue because as a result of the Ukrainian army's offensive, the majority of the Russian invaders have retreated from the Volodar Cats. The truth of what the Russian author wrote was announced by the Ukrainian General Staff. The General Staff reported that the hot clashes in Volodar have significantly decreased, and the Russian invaders have suffered a major setback in the region. The Russian army has not yet captured a single settlement in the 3-week-long offensive in Volodar. Attacks by the army and other military groups have failed. The defense force of the Ukrainian army did not let the Russian invaders pass. The failure of the Russian army in Volodar was described by Mark Kansian, senior advisor to the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as follows: "It shows that the Russians were not able to effectively attack the Ukrainians. They were at a tactical level, and still not very well coordinated." Former U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis told an American media outlet that the Russian military's failure in Volodar was due to tactical mistakes. Despite all these groups and efforts, the city of Boulder, where many different mercenary groups and volunteers work, in addition to the soldiers of the Russian army, is mostly under the control of the Ukrainian army. The failure of the Russian army is now attracting the attention of the whole world because the Russian army could not achieve success for weeks in Volodar. The raid was loaded with almost all its mind. Last week, the British Ministry of Defense announced the dismissal of Colonel General Rustam Muradov, the head of Russia's Eastern Forces Group in Ukraine, citing repeated failures of ill-conceived offensives in Volodar. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is not succeeding. Despite all his efforts, one of the forces of the Russian army that suffered heavy losses in Volodar is the 155th Marine Infantry Brigade. The Ukrainian army has cornered the Russian 155th Marine Brigade, known as annihilated brigade, many times in a series of operations. In fact, according to a new report published the other day by an American research organization, the brigade has been restructured 8 times. The report has stated that the brigade was restructured largely due to losses incurred during the protracted efforts against Volodar. Many Western war analysts attribute the high losses of the Russian army in Volodar to the offensive technique used by the army. The Russian army is conducting a human wave attack in Volodar. This type of attack means charging unprotected at enemy soldiers. This leads to increased losses of military personnel. The losses of the depleted Russian army in conflict-intensive areas such as Volodar and Bakhmut are preparing the end of the Russian army since the beginning of the war. The Russian army has suffered unexpected losses. The losses of the Russian invaders are not limited to military personnel. The Russian army has lost about 200,000 military personnel and millions of tons of equipment. The Ukrainian army's attacks on military bases, ammunition depots, and missile systems belonging to the Russian invaders are increasing the Russian army's equipment problems. The Russian army is running out of ammunition. The number of military personnel is also increasing day by day. The Russian army is losing an average of 500 soldiers a day, and hundreds of its personnel are being treated in military hospitals. Last day, the Ukrainian General Staff announced that military hospitals and medical facilities in the occupied territories are full of wounded occupiers. In its statement, the General Staff said as a result, the enemy is using civilian educational institutions in the temporarily occupied territories for its own purposes. For example, in the village of Vysotsk, Zaporizhia region, the occupiers turned the gymnasium of the local school into a military hospital. Medical services are provided only to Russian soldiers. As of April 15th, about 100 occupiers with varying degrees of injuries were being treated. The losses of the Russian army are increasing every day. The regions were the most intense. Clashes are taking place, such as Volodar and Bakhmut seem to bring the end of the Russian army because the losses and gains in these regions are important enough to affect the course of the war. Russian leader Vladimir Putin's decisions in the upcoming days are eagerly awaited because it does not seem possible for Putin to prevail in these regions anymore. The Battle of Bakhmut is taking firm steps towards becoming a decisive battle for the entire Ukrainian war. Both Russia and Ukraine have focused their attention in the war on this small industrial city. Although the clash of both armies with all their strength to take the city brings huge losses, it is very important for both armies to win this city war, which is important for the course of the war. The Ukrainian army generally guards the defensive lines, except for the offensive operations of the elite Ukrainian troops directed to Bakhmut. The Ukrainian army, which remained on the defensive, has stopped the Russian advance with a smaller number of offensive operations. The Russian army, which could not pass the Ukrainian forces, had to resort to a series of tactical changes. Come on, let's examine together the latest situations about Russia's tactical change and what happened in the Bakhmut war. In the battle for Bakhmut in the Donetsk region, the Russian workforce switched to Syrian scorching ground tactics as the Ukrainian defenders continued to hold the city. The commander of the Ukrainian land forces, Colonel General Oleksandr Kievsky, visited the hottest spots of the front in the Bakhmut region, where the commanders of the military units groped about the progress of the defense and the problems that needed to be resolved immediately. The commander made operational decisions and set the tasks. He also met with the personnel of the brigades of the Ukrainian ground forces, airstrike forces, and territorial defense forces, which heroically resisted the offensive of the Russian army in the Bakhmut region. Kursk gave prizes, valuable gifts, and cash bonuses to the best fighters. The Ukrainian army has exhausted the Wagner mercenaries, so the Russian army now has to include special forces and air assault units in the battles of Bakhmut. The conflict is fierce on both sides. According to Kievsky, the Russian army, which has adopted the so-called Syrian burn-in tactic, is destroying buildings and positions with airstrikes and artillery fire. Commander Bakhmut defense continues. He said the situation is difficult but under control. Artillery units on both sides of the line reportedly turned back fire missions to save ammunition for the long-awaited Ukrainian counteroffensive. Despite ongoing duels, Russian mil bloggers claim that the ammunition supply of Russian troops not involved in the ongoing offensive has been severely reduced. Another mil blogger stressed that the Ukrainian artillery crews were similarly guarding the shells while embedded in an artillery platoon in Ukraine's 56th Motor Brigade. The unit's 152mm howitzers reportedly fired more than 2,230 rounds per day. But that number is now less than 3 nearby units equipped with NATO 155mm caliber guns are reportedly facing less shortages than cannons from the Warsaw Pact era. An unnamed Ukrainian military official claims that Ukraine still fires 7,700 rounds per day. Russian bombardment reportedly dwarfs even this figure. While Western production lines struggled to keep supplies in motion, Ukraine's incredible artillery consumption remains a concern for NATO. The concern of Russian mil bloggers has increased considerably since the leak of a series of classified intelligence reports on Ukraine's war effort. The counteroffensive of the Ukrainian army is getting closer every day. These are the latest signs that Ukraine and Russia are looking forward to the next major engagement, even as the battle for Bakhmut continues. This shows that Moscow wants to be more prepared than it was on its route outside Kharkiv in September. The UK Department of Defense rated Russia's winter campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure as likely unsuccessful. Waves of attacks using missiles and Iranian-made kamikaze drones began targeting the power grid in October. But these large-scale attacks have been rare since early March. Ukraine continues to supply spare components for damaged infrastructure and creates a significant logistical success in transporting 100-ton transformers across the country. However, warmer weather has also helped ease the load on the Ukrainian electricity grid. It is no secret that the Russian forces have so far suffered extremely heavy losses in the war in Ukraine. There is a wealth of audio-visual evidence that the Russian army was destroyed in Ukrainian fields, but the actual casualty figures are quite striking. So how many casualties is the Russian army actually suffered since the beginning of the war? According to U.S. intelligence, a total of more than 220,000 soldiers of the Russian army and the private military company Wagner Group were killed and injured. There are some really important and deep systemic problems in the efforts of the Russian forces at the moment. The latest U.S. assessments that appear put the death toll or injured at over 220,000. These latest casualty figures are 20,000 higher than the previous figures published in recent months. Indeed, each month since November has been more deadly than the last, with an average of more than 18,500 dead and injured each month. The current Russian army casualties are even more than meets the eye. This alone is clear proof that Russian President Vladimir Putin's special military operation against his little neighbor has so far failed spectacularly. The number of Russian casualties has been a hotly debated topic since the beginning of the war. Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has been providing a list of Russian casualties almost daily since the conflict began in February 2022. The figures released by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry include both manpower and weapons system losses. According to the latest official Ukrainian estimates, the Russian army and the private militia company Wagner Group lost 175,000 soldiers in Ukraine. Frankly, this number contradicts Western intelligence's most recent assessment that more than 220,000 Russians were killed and wounded. Until recently, Western casualty estimates tended to be more conservative than Ukraine's claims. Indeed, the West estimates that Russian forces lost about 1,900 main battle tanks, but the Ukrainians said almost twice that. Much more confusing then is this discrepancy in the number of killed and injured. The explanation may well derive from the definition of what constitutes a casualty. So what does Ukraine pay attention to when giving Russian losses? Ukrainians use the word liquidated to refer to Russian losses. However, this choice of word leaves the actual number of dead and wounded to interpretation with purge. Kiev uses a meaning killed or killed and wounded, which is more polite than other phrases. Judging from Ukraine's claims in other categories of Russian losses, such as main battle tanks, we can reasonably consider that the Ukrainians mean killed when using the term liquidated, since it means that they do not take into account the wounded Russians. Adding to the casualties, which standard military wisdom indicates were 2 to 3 wounded for 1 dead, raises the total estimate of Russian losses to 680,000 dead and wounded, which would be consistent with estimates of material losses. However, it can be said that the loss numbers of countries with strong intelligence such as the USA and the UK are more consistent than those of Ukraine. Even if there was no clear evidence about this, the fact that Western intelligence services are active on the battlefield and that the Ukrainian army is constantly providing intelligence from here makes the figures given by Western countries more realistic. One thing that should not be forgotten is that Russia is officially fighting naked against Ukraine's modern weapons. Russian President Vladimir Putin's failure to fully prepare his army before starting the war and the cessation of military expenditures due to the ensuing global economic sanctions put the Russian army in a difficult situation where it could not even meet the basic needs of its soldiers in such a challenging environment. With the clashes becoming so intense, the increase in Russian losses was something expected by all circles. And it did.